Hello and welcome you all to the second day of our conference. This is a virtual session. We have a very interesting session on board here, and we have Rimli here with us. And I will briefly introduce Rimli at first. Uh, I think all of us have been there. All of us have heard Rimli on the last day on the keynote session. However, let me just go through it, uh, and I hope this session is going to be great. All of the three very interesting sessions are here. Just give me a second. Uh, yes, we have Rimli here, Rimli Bhattacharya. She is trained in comparative literature from Jadavpur and Brown universities. She is a translator and collaborator in film, art, and theatre projects. Her work in gender and performance include Binodini Dashi, My Story and My Life as an Actress, Public Women Playing the Icon on the Urban Stage, and the dancing poet Rabindranath Tagore and choreographies of participation. She has engaged with and published extensively on primary education in India and children's literature and has taught a MPhil seminar on childhood pedagogy and expressive forms at the Department of English, University of Delhi for several decades. She has just completed a book-length work tentatively titled Foraging for Children's Literature in India, forthcoming from Bloomsbury. Her translations from Bangla to English include novels by Bibhutibhushan Bandyopadhyay, Aronyok, Making a Mango Whistle, and Restless Waters of Ichamoti, and Rabindranath Tagore's Char Udhhay. She has collaborated with academics, artists, and filmmakers on several international projects. For the past few years, she has been working on a multimedia narrative called Stitching Sails, Rising Oceans, as a part of an international research project on oceanic humanities. Over to you, Rimli. We have three exciting presenters over here, so it's all up to you. Okay. Rimlidi, you have to unmute yourself.
So thank you very much for letting me chair this session, which has a particular appeal for me. Not that I care for conflicts, but we live in the midst of conflicts. So it's wonderful that you are choosing to explore a sensitive area, and I hope that we shall listen to very nuanced and questioning presentations. So let me begin by introducing the first speaker, Diksha Poddar. Just one second. Diksha is currently, can you hear me clearly? Am I audible? Diksha is currently a research scholar at the Center for South Asian Studies, School of International Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, where she's studying the contours of youth, arts, and peace building in conflict areas for her doctoral thesis. She has worked for 7 years at the Praxis of Peace Building, Gender and Development in South Asia. She's associated with an organization called Women in Security, Conflict Management and Peace, an initiative of the Foundation for Universal Responsibility of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Her interest lies within the intersecting themes of gender, youth, creative arts, peace building, and feminist methodologies. She has recently added a chapter on youth and peace building in the Encyclopedia of Violence, Peace, and Conflict, 2022, and co-authored a book chapter called Piecing Up Peace in Kashmir, Feminist Perspectives on Education for Peace in Feminist Solutions to War, from Pluto Publications 2021. She holds an MPhil from the same place where she's located, that is International Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, and also a master's from Ambedkar. She's completed her graduation in economics and political science, and she's also completed diplomas in conflict transformation and peace building. So without further ado, I would request Diksha to please begin. And my one request, this I make to all my students, is please don't race. Leave out if necessary, but what you say we must all hear and internalize. Thank you. Over to you, Diksha.
Thank you so much. Greetings, everyone. As we discuss the many nuances of childhood across historical and geographical context through this two-day conference, I here present my insights on what is it about growing up in conflict areas, particularly armed conflicts that I focus on. I situate my research, this particular research, at the intersection of the literature on childhood studies, youth studies, and even in the larger domain of conflict and peace studies per se. In this particular presentation, I argue that the intersection of these three disciplines, youth studies, childhood studies, and peace and conflict studies, provide a very fertile ground to understand the nuances of what is understood as the transitioning phase, the phase of transition from childhood to youthhood and ultimately to adulthood in situations of armed conflict. In many a times, protracted conflicts, which are armed in nature, blurs the otherwise marked boundaries and experiences that define the transitions from one's childhood to and youthhood, and in much more deeper and violent ways. So the transition is much more violent. That's what I argue for, and the uncertainties, fears, and a sense of hopelessness that comes along, perpetuated due to the cycles of violence, repeated cycles of violence, hamper a rather smooth transition from one phase to another, which the scholarship refers to a phase of Waithoods. So in this presentation, we're going to actually explore what the understanding of Waithoods is when I'm talking about the transitions from one's childhood, youthhood, and to adulthood. Here I also attempt to open a conversation on various nuances of this intermediate phase. The idea is that it's an intermediate phase of transition between one's childhood, youth, and adulthood in the context of conflicts. Some of the questions that this presentation seeks to unravel through the presentation is: how was this transition experienced by young people growing up as children of war? Children of war because they are, I'm talking about generations stuck in conflict. Which is stuck in refugee camps, ghettoized societies, and in zones of perpetual violence. Violence may not be always physical and armed in nature, but the structural and the cultural violence that keeps manifesting itself in case of conflict zones. And how are these experiences of Waithoods informed by the immediate surroundings of a child? These immediate surroundings, I again argue, are very violent in nature. And further, how does these experiences help shape the life of a child who's growing up, and also affects the future of this of child who grows up in a conflict? So how are these experiences shaping the future of a child, and how do these narratives together contribute towards the discourse on youth studies and conflict studies as well as on childhood studies? So while I'm drawing from the three disciplines, I also see how this particular idea contributes back to it. How does it add to the discourse at large? Just a second. Yeah. So I begin with understanding what is Waithoods and how is it related to the phase of childhood and youthhood. So let me begin by understanding what is youthhood. So within the discourse of conflict and peace studies per se. There's a lot of literature that talks about childhood experiences. We have a lot of literature that talks about how children are affected in war, and in terms of conflicts, and how also adulthoods, how adulthoods are shaped in conflicts. However, this idea of youth is very new. It's taking its shape, but it's at a very nascent stage. And so I see the three in a linear progression, that a child grows like a moves from childhood to youthhood and adulthood. So it's in linear in many ways. And this which and how does a conflict affects this linearity is the question that I'm going to sort of deal with here. So youthhood, that is something between childhood and adulthood, is characterized by one's economic, political, and social stability that lie at the heart of this transitional phase. And it is marked by many milestones that indicate towards acquisition of one's own autonomy in relative terms, and an adult status, a status that lies in your next phase, but it's a beginning of your status that you start to identify with, which is derived on evolving capacities and social standing. The most critical of these phases is what we understand as youthhood, or as the phase of betwixt and in between that scholars like Turner argues is identified with a lot of ambiguities around overlapping roles, expectations, and aspirations. Now, from the perspective of childhood studies, the ever evolving situation of conflict with regular episodes of violence are often disturbed and stressful to navigate for a child. And hence the idea of waithhood comes in place. Now, waithhood, as we understand, lies between childhood and adulthood again. And the question here is, does this overlap completely with youthhood? Yes or no, we're going to explore in the presentation. Does this waithhood has an overlapping connections with childhood and adulthood? Yes, we're going to see how and how's about it. So waithhood is also referred to as a generation and waiting, because again we're talking about whole generation or generations which are stuck in conflict. It is involuntary in nature because no one wants to be in a weighted situation, but the conflict, the underlying situations of conflict, forces an individual to be in this involuntary state. And it is also referred to as a wait adulthood, because it's a state where you are waiting to be an adult, waiting to take up adult like responsibilities, and hence wait adulthood is a term that we refer to. Now, I argue that the violent communal, social, and political developments very easily populate to one's personal spaces that hampers a child's growing processes in conflict areas. It is the constant violence, the cycle of violence that populates not just in the physical space or in the social or the cultural space where the child operates, but also in the very personal nature. These includes irregular instances of mourning and grieving at homes. Those instances where a child grows up watching and witnessing these kind of events at homes, in the neighborhoods, and they're so frequent in nature. And they also have restricted mobility. The children, where they're supposed to be in the playgrounds and in schools, their mobility is restricted due to conflict. They're restricted within their homes or the neighborhood at large. And they also have to share household responsibilities at a very early age, because their parents, their fathers, brothers are out fighting the war. So at a very early stage they start picking up household responsibility, which is not natural, that does not naturally come to the age where they are in. And the disrupted schooling is which also adds to the fact that it's some to the abnormality of the situation. And with this whole thing, there is a sense of disruption, interruption, and suspension to the daily routines, and hampers the regular functioning and behaviors within families and in societies at large. And this situation may not just be something that happens for weeks or months. It may actually extend to many years, and we don't know too many. How many would this be? And such pauses and break results in what we understand as a generation in waiting. Regular shutdowns affect the learning cycles. Learning is something which is key to this particular age. So regular shutdowns hampers the learning cycles for the child. There's inaccessibility to schools, and also there are lack of alternative uh, spaces of learning, such as vocational learning centers, recreational activities, parks, sports ground, your art and craft centers, and any other things that the child would otherwise engage in. There's a loss of teaching learning experience, that happens. It's not just in the school, it's not just, you go learn your lessons, but also the other things that a child learns. And also, conflict is also marked by skipped grades. There are mass promotions to the next grades in conflict that happens. That's something one observes due to considerations of conflict. Like, child is not able to move from grade A to grade B and then to C. There are mass promotions, and it happens years and years. Maybe just like over 5-6 years, this child is just promoted without actually learning the lessons. And there are also missed child classroom experiences that hamper children's holistic growing up processes. And this leaves child to be mostly home tutored or learn and grow with the peers. And and also it leaves even at home, it leaves very less space. The conflict leaves very less space for childcare activities, and thus leaving children to explore their new worlds, new realities, which are due to the conflict and violence around, to explore it all by themselves. So they don't have people to go and ask the questions, questions about what's happening around. So they're
Diksha,
usually.
you just have a few more minutes, okay? About 3-4 minutes. Yeah.
Sure. So another important marker of this transition is where the child moves out from the school and is employment ready. They just completed a few years of engaging in an income generation activity and have to be economically independent. So conflict hampers that. The in situation, the employment opportunities are also compromised and skewed. The political situation doesn't provide a healthy environment for the children or young people to be employed and grow and talk about possibilities. And apart from economic factor, there are also social factor that legitimizes one's shift from childhood to youthhood years, and they are derived and regulated within one's social setting. Marriage is one such aspect. It often carries an undertone. Marriage often carries an undertone of economic independence and grounds an individual towards taking up more family-related responsibilities, such as taking care of aging parents, nurturing children. And since economic autonomy is an important requisite for marriages in many cultures, economic instability and personal level due to ongoing political disruptions hinders marriage and family formations. Waithoods are also can be argued to be gendered in nature, as the experiences of different genders in this phase of stuckness vary in proportion to the marginality in conflicting situations. For instance, in traditional local contexts, the condition of economic independence for marriage is living mostly on young men. That further forces young girls into limiting spaces that hinders their psychosocial development. Drawing from the experiences of Southeast Asian countries, scholars have argued at how youthhoods are much shorter for girls, as early marriages soon follow motherhoods, and therefore they are in an adulthood situation much sooner. Thus, for many experiences of growing in conditions of prolonged conflict, young girls interacting with transitions into youthhood and waithoods are deeply rooted in experiences of marginalization and victimization. The arguments made so far reflect on the delaying effects of conflict on one's transition from child to youthhood, as it is discussed in terms of lost years of schooling, poor quality of education, and shrunken opportunities for economic independence, which hamper this smooth transition. In case of delayed transition, youthhood often coincides with childhood, and the progression towards adulthood is much slower, as we see from the slide. While there are delaying effects, there are also accelerating effects too. this transition between adulthood and youthhood and adulthood. And they are demonstrated in ways such as, critical economic and immediate social needs within family that erupts that the children have to respond to, and they are forced to take up adult-like roles and responsibilities. One could see this in the context of child soldiers, child laborers, child marriages, and also child-led household where they're forced to because the they have to actively participate in the ongoing conflict, and they need to attend to the economic and financial needs of the family, or to be surrogate parents to the siblings who lost their parents in the conflict. And but this manifests deep rooted anger, trauma, and frustration among the children and young people who grew up to be adults. So we are not even sure what kind of adults, what kind of psychosocial setup they would be growing up into. So there is also lack of proper avenues to guide and address that situation, which further adds to the perpetration of violence and prolongedness of conflict. I conclude to argue that Waithoods in many conflict contexts coincides with the transition into and from youthhood, and also the experience of youthhood itself. So, it's not that, youthhood 100% coincides with youthhood. It can also spill over to childhood and adulthood as the situation may be. So there is no definitive age bracket that I can put to explain what an waithood situation would be. And therefore I also reversely I also argue that it's important that we move out of these age bracket understanding of childhood, youthhood, and adulthood, because the waithood situation makes it difficult to define these into neatly defined phases and brackets, and because there are associated roles and responsibilities and expectation that needs to be taken into account. For instance, this discussion indicate that in certain contexts, economic autonomy for boys and early marriages for girls are important markers that indicate a closure of one's youthhood, coinciding with the experiences of waithood. While I'm certainly not yet arguing about how discriminatory the nature of the dichotomy is itself, but I certainly argue that the complexity of defining the various phases in these neat boxes when experiences growing of conflict situation lies in between these phases. So it is something that one needs to read in between and through the lens of more compassion and kindness, and also justice that and equity, that one needs to understand these phases, that what exactly we are talking about. And this presentation opens a context for a much deeper conversation around readjusting these lenses to understand these transitions, especially when experienced in one's early years. While age-defined phases are universally more acceptable, it is important that the researchers, policymakers, and practitioners take into consideration that age may not be the only defining demarcator of these phases, as they spill over other categories, as experiences spill over other categories. But there are many other factors that can be taken into consideration, such as one's education status, social status, political acumen, economic autonomy, and or biological factors. Thus, these are
Hello,
dynamic and
Diksha, I can't hear you. Suddenly,
hello.
is
Is
there
it
a
better
problem?
now?
Can others hear you? I can't hear you.
Um,
We
is it
can
The,
better
hear
now?
you.
the sound seems
Yes,
to have
we
gone
can
from
hear
my
you.
screen.
Okay.
Can
So
the
I just
others
want
hear?
Yes, yes, yes.
Can you
Rimliti, we
hear
can
me?
hear her. Yes, yes,
Yeah, but I
we
can't
can.
hear. I can't hear you. I wonder why.
so should I go back or
I don't think we would be able to.
yeah?
Suchetana, I
Uh,
can't hear anyone.
can you hear me, Rimliti? Can you hear me?
Is it better?
Hello?
Hello.
Rimliti, could you please join again?
Yeah,
Rimliti,
but
can you
I'm not.
join?
I
Can you
can't hear
hear me?
anyone.
You can't hear anyone. Okay. Can you just check the microphone that you
What
are
shall I
using
do?
currently? Okay.
Can someone help, please? I can't hear.
It's 12 hours.
Hello? I can't hear anyone. I can't even hear myself.
Rimliti, please
Suchetana,
check
any
if
suggestions?
it has gone mute.
One second. Yes, Suchetana? I have. I have unmuted myself. Oh, I have. Wait, I'll put away the phone. তাহলে বুঝতে পারবো. Just give me a second. Yes, I'm putting it away. এবারে বলো কথা. হ্যাঁ.
রিমলিদি শুনতে
I
পাচ্ছ?
can't hear you, Suchetana. Shall I join again? Shall I join again? Shall I rejoin? Sometimes that helps.
তুমি কি মাইক্রোফোন ইউজ করছো কোনো হেডফোন বা কিছু?
No. But I don't have that, and it was working fine until just like a minute ago.
You can rejoin.
I'm leaving and rejoining. Okay, just hang on because if I.
Absolutely. Give us a few minutes. I have just sent her again that link. So in the meantime, let's just hope that she can join us soon. Otherwise, we are trying to get connected to someone else who can chair this session if it is at all possible. Um, let's just hope, okay, that she can join us soon.
Yeah. Thank you.
আমি আরেকটা ফ্রেশ মেল পাঠিয়েছি, এটা কি কাজ করছে? উম, এটা 1 মিনিট একটু চেষ্টা করে দেখো তো, না হলে আমি জাস্ট, ইটস ফ্রম দ্য কনফারেন্স মেল। হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ, জাস্ট চেক। না না না, নো হোয়ার ইট ইজ রিকোয়ার্ড। মেল আইডি চাওয়ার কিন্তু কিছু জায়গা নেই। No, 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 no. That is a separate mail that you have checked. Just check যেটাতে শুধু তোমাকে অ্যাড্রেস করে একটা মেল করেছি আমি এক্ষুনি দেখো। মানে জাস্ট 12 8 বোধ হয়ে গেছে, 2 minutes ago it has been sent. এটা আসবে স্ট্রিমিয়ার উপরে লেখাটা আসবে। হ্যাঁ, ইমেল অ্যাড্রেস চাইছে তো, ওকে। দাঁড়ান, 1 মিনিট আমি একটু কথা বলে দেখছি। হ্যালো, মেল আইডিটা ছাড়া দেওয়া যাবে না, তাই তো? হ্যালো,
Hello, hello. Sorry, I'm just standing by for your chair today because she really cannot connect to the uh, device somehow. So I think Diksha's paper was on.
Yeah, I was actually just making the last comment, so maybe I can just give it a pass.
Okay, okay. I'm so sorry about this whole thing.
Okay.
Please continue.
So, like, how should I go about it? Should I start or should I just like let it be? Because, or should I sum up in 2 lines for you?
Yes, Diksha, could you please just give us a summing up of, because the whole, the entire presentation was really great and detailed, nuanced, full of nuances. Could you just give us, the concluding thoughts or final thoughts of yours?
Yeah. So basically, I talked about the process of how a child goes from through different phases of childhood, youthhood, and adulthood in conflict situations which are violent in nature, which and how it is hampered by conflict, where there are delayed transitions from one phase to the another because of, say, lack of economic opportunities or employment opportunities or educational opportunities and political situations, as well as social stigmas and problems that arise with institutions such as like marriages, and also how conflict at the same time can also accelerate this transition from one phase from you from a child youth and to adulthood, where children are forced to take up adult like responsibilities at a very young age, like for example being surrogate parents to their siblings where they've lost their parents to conflict, or taking a financial and economic responsibilities at home. So how it also speeds it up. To conclude, I argue that it is important that we don't just look at age bracket or age as the only demarcator of these phases, while there are other considerations to be taken care of, such as economic status, political acumen, biological factors, social interactions, to define one's transitions from child to youth to adulthood. So that was the argument, and I also brought in the idea of waithood and how this youthhood coincides with the idea of waithood, where children are waiting to be growing up or wait for normal right activities to resume. So that was the key argument that I made.
Thank you, Diksha. Rimli, can you hear us?
I can barely hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you are perfectly audible.
Okay. So
So
I
I
had
was
a
just standing by
question.
for you. So yeah,
Thank you
please
so
continue?
much,
Yeah,
Choiti. I just hope that please be there because I'm really
yeah, I'll be
worried
there.
about
I'll
this
be there.
session.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I'll be there.
So
I'll be
I will just take a minute to frame a question for Diksha, which we she can answer once the two other presentations are over. So I'll just frame the question and leave it there, and we can move on to the next speaker. The question, Diksha, is this, and it's a complicated question, so don't worry. You may not have an instant answer. We can discuss it later, maybe. But think the question might be important for you, which is in your presentation in the first phase, you suggested that it was a kind of linear progress, but in the towards the end you complicated that, which is an excellent thing. So my question is this, that between the linearity and the complication of that linearity, how do we distinguish the period of waithood, as you call it, or how do we begin to conceptualize it by looking at other situations where many of these characteristics of rupture, of disruption, of uncertainty, of trauma are also common? And I'll just give you one example of, say, migrant workers, children who are migrant workers themselves. And the classic case of that little girl who died on walking back home, Jamlo, and there was also a story about it. So my question is this, and you also mentioned child soldiers, which I won't discuss now because that requires a whole different context. So simply this, that following up on your own complication to what had earlier seemed like a very simplistic version, how would we then look at, if we at all want to make the conflict zone, of course, apart from the fact that there's actual war, actual shelling, actual violence that is happening right there. So, how would this be different from other kinds of precarious and vulnerable childhoods, where in fact the child doesn't ever be, rest as a child? So, the period of adulthood comes in much earlier in many other cases. So that's my question, and you, as I said, you needn't answer it. We'll move on because I'm really sorry about this problem that has happened. Okay, thank you, and thank you. That was a very enlightening presentation. So we are moving on now to Anne Suzanne Abraham, who's a doctoral research scholar and teaching assistant in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIIC in Bhopal. Her research interests include partition studies, refugee and migration studies, childhood studies, and environmental humanities. She's recently published an essay called An Alternative Vision of Science, Intersections of Science, Sustainability, and Feminism in Begum Ruqaya Sakawat Hussein's Sultana's Dream, in an anthology which is entitled Science Fiction in India, Parallel Worlds and Post-Colonial Paradigms, published by Bloomsbury. So over to you, Susan, and please don't mind if I'm not turning off my mic. It's just that I'm terrified the moment I'll do that, I'll disappear. So I'm hanging in there but silent. And I will also alert you when your 20 minutes are little before your 20 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you. So I have some slides. So let me start presenting. Is it visible?
Not yet, but it's coming in.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's sort of visible. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So is it moving? I think it's moving.
You go ahead, I think, because.
Yeah. Okay, fine. Yeah. So the title of my presentation is The Permanent Liabilities, Representation of Children's Experiences of the 1947 and 1971 Partitions in Amiya Sen's A Good Education. As the title suggests, my paper focuses on the experiences of children in the refugee camps in India after the partition of India in 1947 and the partition of Pakistan in 1971 through the analysis of the graphical representation of Amiya Sen's memoir, A Good Education, which was translated by Bashwati Ghosh and illustrated by Vishwajyoti Ghosh. The memoir connects the post 1947 and post 1971 periods and proves that the experiences of the child refugees in India of the two bifurcations have similarities and convergences, even if there is a gap of 3 decades. Sen takes the readers through the interiors of the permanent liability camps set up by Indian government after the two bifurcations in the history of South Asia. The experiences of children during the 1947 and 1971 partitions are intertwined with the experiences of their mothers. An act called the Abducted Persons Recovery and Restoration came into being in 1949 to recover women and children. But the acceptability of women whose honor in courts had been tarnished was a question, and the citizenship of the children born to these women remained a contentious issue. The debate was compromised on the decision that the women can decide upon the children. and those who cannot take illegitimate child or children back to their original home can leave them in a transit camp in Jalandhar. Similar things happened after the 1971 bifurcation of Pakistan into Pakistan and Bangladesh. Nayanika Mukherjee, in her essay Available Motherhood, extensively talks about the political and nationalistic ideas behind viewing rape victims as Biranganas, the war heroines. Since abortion was illegal in Bangladesh as per state law and Muslim Sharia law, with the help of non-profit organizations like Population Council and the International Women's Health Coalition New York, the government set up menstrual regulation clinics throughout the country in 1971 and in 1972. MR is the clinical procedure of removing unwanted contents inside the uterus to regulate the menstrual cycle. This procedure can be done only during the first trimester in case of pregnancy. The taboo in the term abortion is thus covered by the term MR, menstrual regulation. Different abortion methods were also rampant during the time, but all these procedures were flocked under the guise of MR.
Sorry,
Women,
Anu, I just have to interfere. Are your slides moving? Are you
yeah, yeah.
moving the
I'm
slide?
just,
They are.
yeah,
Uh, you're not moving, right?
yeah,
They're
I
not
just moved it.
showing.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
just
yeah.
the title slide which is showing.
Is it moving? I have changed the slides. Now I'm
No,
on
no,
three,
no,
slide number
no,
three.
no. It's just the title slide which is showing. Now,
Okay,
yeah, now it moved. Now it moved.
okay, fine, fine, yeah. Is it visible?
Yes, yes.
Okay, okay. So the taboo in the term abortion is thus covered by the term MR, menstrual regulation. Different abortion methods were also rampant during the time, but all these procedures were flocked under the guise of MR. Women in the advanced stage of their pregnancy were offered jobs and prepared them to return to legal heterosexual marriages by urging them to abandon their illegitimate children. The abandoned babies were put on for international adoption. The international adoption law was again repealed in the year 1982 after ensuring that all the enemy children were either killed or banished. Thus, the nascent country has been purged and regained its honor through the cleansing of the womb of Biranganas and by the means of the geographical and emotional banishment of children. Another interesting legal turn in the Indian history in connection with this is the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act of 1971. Please note the year 1971. Before 1971, abortion was a criminal offense in India under the Penal Code Section 312. The hasty decision to pass an act to legalize abortion in India was indeed to regulate population control, especially among East Pakistan migrants. My argument here is that the active suppression of the voices of women led to a complete erasure of their children's experiences from the officially documented history of the 1947 as well as of 1971 partitions. In a newspaper article published by the New York Times on 30th September 1971, reporter Sidney H. Schanberg states that malnutrition and contagious diseases were widespread in the camp and children were the most vulnerable victims. Schanberg states that there was a delay in addressing the issue of children by the Indian government because the local population was also suffering from similar problems. Amiya Sen, in A Good Education, states the same reluctance on the part of the Indian government towards the East Pakistan refugees. The only aids these children received were some blankets and milk powder from the US, UNICEF, and other non-profit organizations as part of their rehabilitation programs. Vishwajyoti Ghosh sketches the figure of Uncle Sam to represent the US aid. The Uncle Sam in the narrative has an Indian beard, a skeletal body, and an American hat to represent the US aid that India received during the post partition period. Sen distributes milk powder among the refugee women for their kids and praises America. This is a result of America's magnanimity. While others got patent tanks, we got unlimited milk powder. We should remain grateful to America. With this representation, Sen marks the place of nascent India in a larger view of the global context. The way America views India is the same way in which India looks down upon its own subjects, especially refugees. This can also be viewed as an example of how each section in the power hierarchy looks down upon those lower in the hierarchy of global power politics and dynamics.
Anu, sorry to interrupt you again. Are
Yeah.
you clicking on the slides? Is the
Yes.
third slide? We are still viewing the third slide.
Third slide. Okay. From my end, it's moving. So I'm not sure why.
Are you on the slideshow?
Yeah,
It's not
I'm on
moving.
slide
Yeah,
five
it
now.
moved now. It just
Yeah, it
came to
moved
slide
now.
5. Yeah.
Okay, fine. Yeah. Intersections of caste and class in a good education. It is also mentioned in the excerpt that Sen's family too has a history of migration from Barisal. The memories of their home in Barisal still lingers in Sen's memory, and she shares this memory in the form of bedtime stories to her grandson Prince. To contrast with the children growing up in the refugee camps and in privileged families like Sen's, Kosh, the illustrator, shows a two-storied house as tall as palm trees in the background when Sen unpacks the nostalgic memories of their house on the other side. This kind of nostalgic recollection is absent among the refugees in the camp. Most of the inmates in the camps are from economically weaker sections and belong to the bottom of the caste hierarchy. Ghosh sketches their faces inside a broken mirror to represent their irrevocably broken dreams for a better life. To make the contrast more visible, Ghosh also shows a framed, unbroken photograph of Sen's grandfather in the narrative. While Sen urges her son to look back nostalgically at their home and their past lives, the mothers in the refugee camps urge their children to consider them as a privileged lot by telling them the mythological story of Rama. The constant recollection of their past lives may trigger violent memories, which will later affect their lives immensely. So it could be an instinct of the mothers not to transmit the burden of memories, but rather consider the lives in the camps as a blessing. The story of Ram, the god in exile, might heal the emotional scar, but at the same time unconsciously forces them to accept their sufferings, which are not at all caused by their own actions, but a play of power politics, in which they are victims. Ghosh shows Prince, Sen's grandson, with a crown and a bow and arrow, who closely resembles the figure of Rama. It could also mean that the exile for the elite refugees like Sen and her grandson was only temporary. Even after a significant period of difficulty, they could recover fast and rebuild their lives. But for the other refugee children in the camp, even though they think their plight is only for some time, they are permanent liabilities to the state. The duty ascribed to Sen by the government is to break the family and separate the children from their mothers in the name of better education. As an official serving the government, Sen was forced to execute the decision of the government to break up the families. The magic realist frame makes the narrative richer as a piece of art. We see a few things like mats, pots, lamps, and bags the refugees brought with them plead to Sen not to break the families. Please don't break. I thought, please don't break up the families. If they get separated now, they might never be reunited. Please try to take the entire families. Unquote. Ghosh makes these material things speak because these are the only things the refugees brought with them and the only things they have as their own. The next step the authority took to make the women agree to the government's plan was persuasion. She described the facilities available at the orphanage in Delhi for the children. I got electricity, water, fan, clean beds, nice big rooms, and great education. Unquote. When Sen understood that the mere description of the amenities in the orphanage will not work, she took out the ultimate weapon and appealed to the mother's love. She pleads with the mothers who are entirely dependent on the system to leave their children for the betterment of their lives. It is certain that these kids who are now taken from their mothers will not be allowed to return to the camp for at least 15 years. The children taken to the other parts of India will be continuously reformed and may speak a different language that the mothers would not understand when they return. It is also not sure that the camp and its inmates will be there after 15 years. Still, the mothers who only want to see their children to be in a good place agree to the demand of the authorities. Um, okay, one of the women tells Sen, take them with you. We don't want to see them. Let them stand their own feet, unquote. There is an unease from the part of the society to view children as equal to adults. It is true that they are dependent, but that does not mean that
Anu,
children. Yes.
Anu, just interrupting for a second to say
Huh.
that you should start winding up. Yeah,
Oh, okay,
sorry
fine,
about
fine.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Here, in the case of refugee children, their dependency is misinterpreted as lack of agency. And in the name of better education, they are forcibly separated from the mothers. I'm not saying that the entire policy of education for refugee children was wrong, but the mode through which the education was implemented led to a systemic violence in the case of refugee children. The state may be able to provide better growing condition for the refugee children, but breaking families to provide them better education is denying them the basic right to live inside the family. The mothers, even though they are dependent on the state also fail to understand the agency of their children and themselves and decides to send their children to the orphanage. Here, in the view of the state, children's bodies are an absent presence. Peter Hopkins and Malcolm Hill, in Contested Bodies of Asylum Seeking Children, observes that the state stereotypes work in powerful ways to stigmatize unaccompanied children as less deserving and less important than other children. Unaccompanied minors' bodies are thereby negatively stereotyped, socially excluded, and geographically segregated as a result of the stigma associated with their status as asylum seekers. This kind of stereotyping is of children in the Indian camp is visible in the attitude of Sen's grandfather, who represents the elite refugees and the state in the narrative. Koch sketched him as a bald man with spectacles but no eyes. He symbolically represents the state which does not have the eye to see the suffering of the refugee kids. Sen is also shown, especially when she addresses the mothers in the camp, as standing on a pedestal, you see, urging the sad, helpless mother to leave their children. Here, the grandfather figure and Sen herself becomes synonymous with the state's ignorance and callousness. The narrative shows how the state intervenes in the personal lives of its most vulnerable subjects and complicates their lives. The visual grammar of the text, enhanced through the achromatic color scheme, parallel hatching technique, and the magic realist lens contributes highly to the grim setting of the camp and the grief stricken conditions of its inmates. The analysis of Sen's narrative unveils how the state further divides the future generation of India as part of its nation building process. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very, very rich paper. I will again do the same that I had done for um, the earlier speaker, Diksha, in the interests of time, uh, and in the, what shall I say, the viciousness of the technology with which we are forced to. I mean, talk about violence. If this is not violence, I don't know what is. So my question again is a complex one, and I would request you not to try and feel obliged to answer it now, but you can maybe begin the process. It is this, that while you've very carefully separated the many strands of uh, of the condition of the woman, you've linked it to the prevailing prevalent policies on abortion, the different euphemisms used to tackle is very deliberately I'm using it, to tackle what is obviously quote unquote a national shame and a national problem, even if the term Birangana is used. But so you've done all that very, very carefully, the strands. I think what I would like you to maybe come back a little bit more on is the question of the family itself. How would you define the family in a refugee camp where the woman is a rape victim, or she's been abducted, and where clearly, and this has been shown, I mean, there's been massive research on the 1947 experience on both sides to show how there were conflicting opinions within the family, not just opinions, actions within the family, about the nature of what to do with this person, who's both a victim and potentially, and that is what your paper has been trying to nudge us to, that potentially she should and must be recognized as a person with some agency. But so there's a so I would like you to, I mean, as I said, this is a long, I mean, itself it's a paper, but just begin maybe to formulate some possibility of how we then rethink the notion of the family. For example, the child who is being separated from the mother by the state with the hope of better amenities. What is this child's father? Where is that space for the father? And what are the conflicting thoughts from the remaining, let's say it's a joint family or an extended family, what are the thoughts there? So I'll leave you with that question, and we'll move on to so thank you again. And I'm hoping, in fact, with all the people in this session, that we can later on, once I'm back in Delhi and all these technology problems are resolved, we can have a nice, long, leisurely Google chat meeting, because I really, really have lots to discuss and ask and learn from all of you. So we now move on to Dr. Sunetra Mitra, and thank you so much for your patience. I know it's terrible when you're the last speaker and all these things are happening. So Dr. Sunetra Mitra is an associate professor of history at RKSM Vivekananda Vidya Bhavan. As a teacher, she has been, her focus has been on modern Indian history, besides aspects of ancient and medieval Indian histories. Um, there's a lot of noise. I don't know. We are all muted. I don't know where the noise is coming from. She studied in Presidency College and Calcutta University, majoring in modern Indian history. Her PhD was on the professionalization of colonial theatres of Bengal and Gujarat from a comparative point of view. I'm going to, yeah. Since then, her areas of interest have been cultural and performance studies. Her book, The Dawn of New Entertainment Genres, is a comparative study of professionalization of Bengali and Gujarati colonial theatres between 1870 and 40. Her papers on Bengali theatre were just the best papers in the Indian History Congress, held in 2002 and 2003 respectively. Her work has been critically acclaimed. She has completed 2 terms of associateship at the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies in Shimla. She's also worked on popular war films of Bollywood, and she's currently studying the history of development of social services as envisaged by Rabindranath Tagore and Shami Vivekananda, and their implications for modern India. So, with that, over to you, Sunetra. You may please first give the title of your paper since I didn't want to do it myself. Okay. And I'm going to disappear from the camera, but I'll be there. Yeah.
Everybody, and thank, and I am not at all impatient in waiting for this, because these technical glitches are something that we cannot help. When it was not, we were not deliberately, nobody was deliberately planning these glitches at this. So at the very outset, I want to thank the organizers for gifting us with such an erudite seminar, and I feel much obliged to present my work here. My paper today is entitled Reminiscing Childhood in Autobiographies, Actors of the Colonial Stage. Since we are running a little late and we are delayed and everybody is quite tired by now, so I think without much ado, I would straight away go to the I will straight away go to the subject of my paper, which deals with two autobiographies, one by Noti Binodini and the other one by Joyshankar Sundari. Their autobiographies are titled respectively as Amar Kotha, the one by Noti Binodini, and Thora Asu Thora Full by Joyshankar Sundari, one of the most prominent actors of the Gujarati stage and one who has attained immortality through impersonating female roles. So I will be looking at their autobiographies, which are where the experiences narrated in both of them are in both of these autobiographies are are similar and dissimilar at the same time. So because of the time constraint, I am straight away going into the main content of my paper. So I am not problematizing my theme. I engage in discussing the two texts I have chosen for today's discussion. In case of Bengal, the one recruited as child artists were young girls who almost invariably came from extremely underprivileged backgrounds, socially and economically. We have Binodini Dashi's account and observations in her autobiography Amar Kotha, which in many ways reflects the general mood of the child actresses who were contemporaneous to her and hailed from similar backgrounds. Binodini's account of her life as an actress clearly states the conditions against which she and most of others like her had joined the stage. She was brought to the stage at the age of 10. At 18, she was at the peak of her career, and at 23, she decided to leave the stage. As a child, she was brought up in a Calcutta slum, in a household characterized by the absence of adult males. This is a very significant point. I would come back to that later. In her autobiography, Binodini talks about the environment of the slum with considerable distaste and remembers herself as a child looking upon her neighbors with fear and surprise and hoping she would never have to face such contempt. She had been told of her marriage at the age of 5 or 6, and there was a boy in the neighborhood whom others referred to her as her husband. Whether this might have become a significant event in her life can only be speculated upon, because everything changed when her mother agreed to give her to the theatre as a child actress on a monthly salary. Binodini reminisces. What is most striking about Binodini's autobiography is the way she starts off and where she and the way she looks at herself. She begins it at the very preface to her work. She is using the term Ami Jogot Majhe Kolonkini Potita. I hope all of you understands Bengal, because it's easier for me to quote from the to read from the Bengali if you are all comfortable with Bengali. So, and repeatedly she is pointing out at a dismal background, and she is so full of, and she regrets the fact that she's a fallen person. She is one who has who cannot look up to anybody for support. This is something that comes back again and again in the preface, but later on she comes out as a very brave woman and who has challenged the social restrictions imposed by the social restrictions then imposed upon her. Binodini recounts. I get back to the autobiography. Binodini recounts here in her autobiography, and here I have largely used Rimli's translations, but I would, if you suggest, I don't mind going back to the Bengali version as well. Binodini recounts here in her autobiography, in those years of childhood, the luxurious new world seemed to be new to me. I did not understand anything. I did not know anything, but whatever was taught to me, I followed faithfully to the best of my ability. I was spurred whenever I remembered the difficulties besetting our household. My enthusiasm quickened at the thought of my mother's sorrowful face. I felt if I could earn something during this period of sorrow in my mother's life, then our financial burdens would be somewhat lightened. So you see, she is recruited as a child at the age of 9, but her experience, her feelings are not like that of a child. Here she is almost overnight turned into an adult, burdened by the fate of her family. So I have typically described this as a as denial of childhood, the deliberate denial of childhood. Clearly, the need to save her family from poverty was the driving factor. Thus, when she joins the stage, she no longer remains a child but an adult whose earnings actually helped her family survive. The frivolities of childhood could not be masked by the sudden thrust of adulthood. Binodini's account of her life is replete with examples of her childish pranks, and a few incidents bring out this facet rather well. Rimli Bhattacharya makes a very interesting observation in this connection. She observes that as a child, emotionally and mentally, she outstripped her body, for she played the part of the heroine even before her teens. As Vinodini recounted, but the dresser had no end of a trouble trying to dress me for the play. I was quite little, but had to play the part of a young maid. That's in My Life, page 135. Rimley explains dressing up has always been exciting for children, more so for a girl who had few clothes and little or no material possession, and for Binodini, as it must have been for many other actresses of the time, dressing up to play the part of the princess had special appeal. When she joins the theatre, the senior actress Raja takes her under her wing and has clothes stitched for her. Binodini uses the word to describe this relation. I had become quite a nauta of a famous actress, she says. Binodini's autobiography even captures the usual mood swings, the excessive high spirits that often earned her the wrath of the concert people, the proud Kadambini in particular, when they were in Delhi, and for her mother and of her mother on several occasions. Dedicated to acting at an early age, I had from the early years of understanding become so enthusiastic and high spirited under the tutelage of Girish Babu that I would be upset by the slightest harsh word from anyone. At any rate, I had confidence building up inside me, and my theatre friends gave me immense love. As a child performer, Binodini never suffered from any dearth of love and affection. After every misadventure, natural and technical, the theatre people handled her physically and emotionally in order to induce her to get on with the performance. Her stiff, for example, her stiff frozen body is chafed and warmed by Chotobabu after the ill-conceived elephant ride. She is bandaged up by him after she falls from the horse with the collapse of the earthen embankment. Against her willfulness, her stubbornness, her high spiritedness, her excesses with constant soothing and assuaging, his mentors got her to do what was required by appealing to her vanity and her excellence. As a child, Binodini appears not to have perceived this, or at least she does not represent this as a manipulation or coercion. She took it as a confession of their dependence for a professional excellence. The position of the professional actress, argues Partha Chatterjee, was a creation of the new educated middle class culture, supplying a need produced by requirements of the new public theatre modeled on European lines. Yet it was a need that was difficult to fulfill within the norms of respectability laid down for women. The solution devised by the early generation of the theatre producers was to recruit young women from among the city's prostitutes and train them in modern techniques and dramatic arts. It became a remarkable educative process in itself, producing women schooled in the language and sensibilities of modernist literary who learned to think of themselves as professional career artists and yet were excluded from respectable social life by the stigma of immoral living. Theatre, which was then the confluence of the best literary minds of the time, offered them an escape from the despicable lives that they led. For these actresses, even as a child, the induction into theatre was therefore the stepping stone to the recognition of their creativity into the world of Bhadralok as well. To quote once again from Binodini's autobiography, the theatre in those days was a place for literary discussions. There was so much discussion on so many varied topics. I understood very little of it then, but I did realize that the theatre was in those days a meeting ground for the distinguished group of Bhadralok. The wait and eagerness with which they waited for the rehearsals, for the carriages to take them to the theatres, reflect their desire for a better life, which was sought after even at that early stage. The following passage from Binodini's autobiography expresses a longing to remove itself from its immediate environment to a world of role playing. I cannot explain why, but as for myself, I thought only of when the carriage would come to fetch me and when I would find myself in the theatre. I wanted to see how the others conducted themselves on the stage. I forgot almost to sleep or eat in my excitement. I could only practice in secret how Podu had walked at a particular point or how Loki had said something on another occasion. I was rather young and I did not have a room of my own. It was inevitable that the others would catch me at my activities and laugh at me. I would run off whenever that happened. So this, see, the paragraph at the same time captures the childishness, the child in Vinodini, as well as an adult mind, the longing to learn, the longing to be part of that illustrious world. Well, this is well, this is part of Binodini's experience. I will come back to Binodini again. I here I just switch over to the Parsi and Gujarati theatre. In the early 20th century, leading Parsi and Gujarati companies still hired men to perform women's roles. The end of the 19th century, when these impressionable boys took to the stage, was an age of infectious song and story as reflected from Joyshankar Sundari, who belonged to the Nayak or Bhojak community, traditionally known for reciting genealogies and narratives along cycles of veterans. Sundari was a female impersonator of the highest order. Through his method of total identification with women, he created idealized feminine characters that were widely imitated. Sundari's stage movements, attire, and speech became models for women offstage. Of all the texts, Sundari's narrative comes as the closest to crafting the bourgeois self of colonial modernity. Joyshankar's autobiography chronicles in linear fashion the growth of a sensitive individual through various episodes of training to a pinnacle of professional success. He appears first as a spirited and gullible child, by nature drawn to music and oral performance, of the simultaneous growth of Gujarati theatre and Sundari's own life. He proceeds from his childhood phase of immaturity to school, where he becomes overtly rebellious, bunking classes and barely passing first grade. His parents, knowing their offspring to be more interested in performing than studying, arranged for him to join a large theatre company. Joyshankar encounters a more ambiguous terrain when he apprentices himself to Dadabhai Thunti. Here too, his story hones to the pattern of gradual progress by steps. The new regime in the Parsi theatre was as strict as that of the village schoolmaster, but Thunti is also also a father figure, a pillar of strength and wisdom. Joshua pupil masters the Urdu language ahead of other newly recruited boys and begins to perform feminine roles, replacing the Bengali actresses in the company. And I will here read from Joyshankar's autobiography. Among the Bhojaks of Visnagar was the village where he was born. Our family had been quite prosperous for 3 generations. My grandfather had found fame through his music, and in our caste, and especially among the Jains, he was a well-known singer. He was a hereditary musician at the house of Hemabhai Bhattacharya. Tribhuvan Das was a singer for many years in the household of Jason. I spent my mornings listening to grandfather singing Ananda Khan's Padas or the Ashtapodis from Gil Govinda. Sometimes father accompanied him on the Tanpura. Listening to grandfather practice every day, we all learned to tell good music from bad. The musical tones echoing in my ears created ever new shapes and waves. Other influences and Shanskaras similarly shaped my childhood being, giving me a definite identity. 96. The teacher was Hargovind Mehta, a person of distinct talents. He was world famous for his beatings, a believer in spare the rod and spoil the child. He kept an eagle eye on his 75 to 100 students seated in 4 rows. If he saw a student talking or slacking off, who threw a small ball at him, which was come up front to be beaten. He had a nice seemed like a prison. The education he
Sunetra, you
imparted
have
in the
about another
atmosphere
4-5 minutes. Okay?
Okay. I would bunk school and go to watch the sadhus perform their daily rituals near the temple. In 1899, George Shankar was recruited by a Percy Theatrical Company in Calcutta, and with his family's permission, he comes to Calcutta. George Shankar, while coming to Calcutta, halted in Mumbai, where he gave all of us boys an Urdu song to memorize. Because of the language, I had a hard time of it. I was unable to get it completely by heart. So Shokharam dealt with 2 steps, saying, "You will get more of that from my hand if you don't learn properly." Then he showed me the bamboo cane, and I remembered my school days. I was afraid beatings were written on my forehead. It seemed my enthusiasm waned. Similarly, in Calcutta, Dadabhai Thunti had a very harsh temper, and beating was his way of teaching as as though that were the only Sundari says, as though that was the only method. Sometimes the corporal punishment was very severe, unrestrained. Our rough voices did get proper training, but we had to endure much punishment for our mistakes. In the 32 months I spent in Calcutta, I learned the female companion roles within all the old dramas. Fortunately, certain Bengali actresses Dadabhai coached me every afternoon, making me memorize their speeches in poetry and prose. After the first performance, Sundari fondly remembers, Dadabhai was happy with me and paid a lot of attention to my different roles. In the beginning, I played bit of big parts as a Sakhi. Nobody congratulated me. So this is how Sundari recounted his childhood memories. Now I go over to the conclusion. These autobiographical writings of the playwrights constitute a unique resource for the study of theatre and cultural history. Theatrical moments became inevitable historical documents fortuitously preserved in public individuals. Their narrators tell of childhood, of growing up, of entering the wider world and struggling for success. The 2 autobiographies I discussed offer contrasting studies of childhood. The two of childhood, Binodini's account of her life, Amar Kotha, in her own words, is a saga of stories. Yet her reminiscences of a childhood when she was just an apprentice at the theatre, often revealed in her diary entries, warmth, affection, and indulgence within a disciplined hierarchical setting cannot be overlooked. Despite her very young age, the realities of everyday drudgery kept Binodini aware of a social position, about the need for a job. She clearly loved her work and excelled at it too. In contrast, Sundari's account, written at a mature age, speaks of a different reality. By his own admittance, Sundari came from an affluent background and his love for music was genetically derived. As a child, Sundari did not like school, and the fear of being physically beaten up for the slightest mistake made him abhor institutional learning. With permission from his parents, he left for Calcutta to be trained for theatre. Here again, the rigors of discipline and punish frightened him. He longed to go back to home, but there was no looking back. He begins his march towards stardom in a loveless environment. As a child, he pined for some affection, and his account fondly records his loving moments. As a Sundari came to Calcutta at the age of 9, much before professional theatres in Bengal started. He was part of the Parsi theatre repertoire. When Binodini joined Bengali theatre, it was already in the country that hired actresses on a regular basis. This practice has not yet started anywhere else, though the Parsis would start recruiting. The Parsi theatre would start recruiting actresses sooner or later. It is not in the scope of the paper to discuss the socio-cultural impact of westernization for the stages. Theatre definitely is a very different kind of work. The practice of theatre can be understood as an amalgam of clerical and artisanal modes springing from the twin bases of the social identity of the members, their limited schooling and their apprenticeship in skilled manual trades. The theatre company trained its members in much the same way as other artisanal enterprises. Theatre apprentices were taken on, given menial jobs to do little or no pay, tried out in small roles, and only gradually incorporated into the company if they showed ability in a succession of increasingly demanding tasks. The young actors learned their skills not by formal instruction but by participating in the production process, at first in easy or unimportant tasks and gradually in more difficult or bigger ones. These actors were involved from the start in the performance of real public shows. Inside the theatre world existed an extended family which was subsumed into a larger project of self
Sunetra,
realization. Yeah, I am finishing.
Sunetra, yeah, just wrap it up now,
Yeah,
and
I'm just finishing.
whatever is left in your
Yeah,
paper,
yeah.
you can come back to
No,
it
no,
later.
nothing is left. Nothing is left. I am just was subsumed of which the company's business success was a visible proof. Recruitment was a form of assemblage in which actors were taken not for specific tasks, but as a whole, persons bringing with them a trail of potentially helpful or harmful family connections, experiences, and habits. In this extended family, the child actors were accorded their share of love and affection, while the outside world looked expectantly at them like any other adult. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunetra. That was a very comprehensive paper on looking at completely different traditions, different languages, different musical sensibilities. So, the one question that I will put to you, because there are many, but for now, is if you could perhaps develop a little bit more on, you talked about Sundari coming from a affluent family, and you briefly in passing you talked about the musical thing, but if I may pose it as a larger question, not just in relation to these two subjects of your paper, but the broader, because one of the things that I have, as you know, been constantly arguing about is that there was no one template for colonial modernity.
Exactly.
And similarly, that it's only when we start juxtaposing different traditions, different modes of rethinking the traditional, because even musical tradition itself is being redefined completely,
Yes.
and the multilingual compositions of many of these professional companies. So it's only when we take all that into account that we can actually even begin to theorize the beginnings, the possibilities, and the divergences of colonial modernity. So,
Yes.
keeping music as the nucleus, would it be
Yes.
possible when we reconvene now to for you to offer, even if it's a speculative, provisional argument? Yeah. So that's my very broad, but I hope somewhat complex question. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to
You
ask
have
the sorry.
you have raised a very pertinent question, because
Well, that's my
all
job.
the
That's my
yeah,
job.
yeah.
So, so
No, no, well, see, it's not possible in the context of this seminar to point out, because the
exactly,
Parsi theater
exactly.
companies,
But I
the
feel that the
Parsi,
job of a chair is not just to ask information-based questions, but to go beyond and provoke a
beyond that.
future seminar, a future paper.
uh,
So first I'm going to ask the organizers, how much time do we have? It's 1.18 by my watch. So how many more minutes do we
We,
have for
I think
discussion?
we have to wrap up by 1:30.
Okay, so we have 12 minutes. So may
Yeah,
I request each of the speakers, and we can, this time we can go backwards. That is, we can start with
yes,
Sunetra and move back to Diksha. So 12 minutes means each of you has
3 minutes.
roughly 3 to 4 minutes
Okay.
maximum. I would say aim for three, to just offer the beginnings of an answer.
Mm, okay, Rimli, I start there. I take the cue from you about the musical tradition that I talked about in case of Jaisankar Sundari. Let me tell you, for the part, because it's in the first place, it's very difficult to distinguish, to differentiate between Parsi and Gujarati theatre, because Gujarati theatre was an offshoot of the Parsi theatre, and there is a long history of that disconnect of the growth of Gujarati identity and how the Gujaratis broke free of the Parsi influence and developed their own stage. But all Gujarati actors started their career in the Parsi stage, and later on they shifted to Gujarati stage. And the musical tradition that you were talking about, the indigenous musical tradition, the Parsis, they had men who were specially recruited to look out for these young talents, for these young musicians from the Bhojak community of Gujarat, because they were most talented. They had a long tradition of, they had a long musical tradition, and once they were brought to Mumbai or to Kolkata, the places where this where the companies had big theater, had big theaters, had popular theaters running, public what had this commercial theaters running, there they would train up these boys in Urdu or Hindi or in other languages. So that was a very arduous training process, and in case of Sundari we have seen he was, he was learning and unlearning at the same time. First he picked up, initially he was trained in Gujarati, then he picks up Urdu, his accent develops, but then when again he goes back to Mumbai, he has to unlearn the Urdu he has learned in Calcutta and learn it speaking in the Mumbai way, in the Bombay way. So this is the experience not just of Sundari, but of Radhesham, Kothabachok, and all the Fida Hussain and everyone. Because whatever accent they brought in, that they had to give up that accent for the locality in which they were performing. And the musical tradition also, they had to forget. The basic training in music remains, but they have to adjust to the new gharanas that they were brought into. So it's a very,
Okay,
very
that is
interesting point.
absolutely a fantastic answer that you've given. Because the reason I say it's fantastic is not only have you begun very focused, in a focused way to answer the question, but it just opens up so much about this
Exactly.
ability to improvise, the ability to learn and unlearn. So we'll have, as I promised, we'll have a longer Google Chat session because I really want
Of
to know
course, of
more and
course.
share
Yes,
more.
yes.
But we'll now move on to Anu Susan and listen to her thoughts. And again, I apologize for the very short time you have. But as I said, it's a beginning. So please carry on.
Okay, you asked me about the concept of family, the question of family in the context of conflicts or violence. So, the question of family is actually complicated, and I don't think I have a very solid answer for it because the concept of family is already broken and irrevocably broken. So, and what is the space of the fathers? In the context of 47 and 71, I don't think they I don't think the question of fathers is not even taken as important because as a patriarchal system like India, they are always accepted, they are always in, and and there is also a tendency of viewing these fathers like of these illegitimate children as enemies, like Pakistani fathers, they are enemies, because that is also a play of power politics. Because um, that viewing that Pakistani fathers as enemies serves some agendas. For example, it can arise nationalistic fervor among the scattered parts of the country, and it can unite the scattered parts of the nascent country. And it is always, and there is no question of tarnished honor in case of fathers. And they are always in, they can rebuild their lives, they can have a normal life, family life. And in case of children who are illegitimate and the rape victims, their mothers, it is always, their stories are always suppressed and they are not given a chance, like, to have a family of their own this this illegitimate, so-called illegitimate children. And I will definitely probe more into this concept of family. Definitely we will have a conversation later. Yeah.
So thank you, Anu. As I said, there were many more questions I had, but I had to restrain myself, mute myself. And as I said, I'd be delighted to, with all three of you, to have a longer conversation. Maybe once I return uh, and actually push more in. That's what these papers are for. So in the 5 more minutes that we have, sorry, Diksha, you have all of 4 minutes because we'll just keep 1 minute. Yeah.
No problem. So, you asked about how do I look at it from through the lens of migrant workers and refugee communities per se, the idea of faithhood. Certainly, yes. I began with a linear approach, then went towards more a complex issue. The argument was certainly pointing that it's not something that you just look from one lens and you get an answer for it. The reality is much more complex in nature, and that's what the lens, when I look at from the discipline of peace and conflict studies, reveals. And it's just a beginning, I'll say. And when I bring in the idea of refugees, migrant population, and other marginalized societies and communities within the larger discourse that we study these narratives, yes, they bring in their idea of complexity. It would certainly not anymore even so simpler what it looks like. For example, the whole idea of violence is what one can look at from. In armed conflict, there is a whole concept where we look at it from the physical violence, the armed conflict, when you're experiencing violence in your everyday lives. But when I look at it to the communities of, say, migrant communities, the violence is experienced very differently. It may not be the physical violence that we talk about, but so many structures that manifest itself to make the situation difficult for existence and for daily functionings to appear to happen in the way they should. ought to be. So the idea of violence is what challenges at the core of it. And then it also brings in the whole idea of new or deferred perspectives of how the economics of it, how the political situation, how the social, how the psychological and social psychological conditions play into defining and redefining this kind of a nuanced understanding of waithood, or the transitions, even if you don't want to use the word waithood here. So there are these different ideas that certainly adds to the complexity, and I think it would be even more interesting to explore it beyond the idea of peace and conflict studies, where we try to expand it to, say, migrant studies, as you pointed out, or even violence, or situations in, say, for example, higher education spaces, the discriminations, or even the structural kind of discrimination that we look at, maybe through the gender lens. It would be a lot more interesting to see it once we try to dwell with it in like more deeper sense, and try to expand it to other disciplines as well. So I think it would be interesting. Yeah, and that's just my initial response to it. But looking, yes,
Yes.
yeah,
No, thank you, all three of you. This was absolutely, my heart sort of cries out for this kind of a session where people, the speakers, are deeply absorbed in what they're doing. They're doing it with passion, with commitment, and with an open mind. At the risk of sounding like a pompous ass, I'll say this. I mean, what for me is the greatest reward, and I just keep praying to whoever is there, Allah or whatever name you choose to give him or her or it, that that I also continue to have this open mind. In fact, in my case, it's a curse, because I always see the other side as well. As you, by now you figured it out, that I just passionately believe in something, and then I always raise questions about what I passionately believe in. So thank you, all three of you, and of course the organizers, for getting us together in the first place. And I hope this is the beginning of longer conversations with each one of you. I think Diksha, you're in Delhi at the moment, are you? Yeah.
yes,
So
I'm
we
in
can
Delhi.
maybe even actually physically meet up. Nothing compensates our sitting together and having a cup of chai or a drink or whatever, or a cigarette. And
Sure.
others, Calcutta, I will keep coming, and Bhopal, I have desire to go to Bhopal in the not too distant future, because, as you know, there's lots of educational institutions there for children with which I am in touch. So I'm just telling the organizers, it's exactly 1.30. I think ours has been a model group of timekeeping and patience and passion. And once again, really warm thanks to Suchetana, Choiti, all of you. I can't mention you individually, but I will write a proper letter soon. And thank you very much. So, for the moment, a
Thank you,
provisional
Rimli.
goodbye. Yeah.
Yeah, it was perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.